Shattered, a SAO tale by Reis123 Chapter 1, link start author's note first of, yes, the cliché title of the chapter was necessary. I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist it. But jokes aside, I welcome you all, old and new readers, to Shattered. I just have the base plan for the FIC in mind, and pretty much everything else is a blank space for now, so feel free to give suggestions, though I don't promise to follow them. If you see any mistakes, in grammar or otherwise, don't feel shy about pointing them out too. I'm just human, no matter what some of my old readers might say, so I also make mistakes, and quite a lot of them. I also have no problems in making corrections, so be my guest. Let's build this story together. I'm publishing Shattered because it's a story I've really enjoyed writing lately, and I felt like if I didn't put it out there, I would end up losing my drive, not to mention that readers are half of any novel. I'm still a student, not to mention I also have a part-time job, so I can't promise regular chapters, but I will try my best to have regular releases on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Just one more thing before I let you go. I wouldn't say the novel has a slow start, but the first 12 to 15 chapters are about what happened during the first month of SAO. It's important for the character and world building. Don't worry, though, there will be plenty of stuff happening to keep you entertained. That being said, I hope you enjoy the first chapter of Shattered. Leave comments and reviews. Life wasn't easy. No, quite the opposite. Life likes to throw you curveballs, or just straight up hit you in the gut, and then kick you while you are down just for good measure. He learned this very early in life. He didn't know exactly when. Maybe when his drunk father came home one day and hit his mother. Maybe when that same man just took off and left them. Maybe when his books were thrown to the ground and stomped on by the school bullies. Or maybe it was when he toiled hard during his university days, only for his professor, his mentor, to claim all his work as his, and leave him discredited, called a liar, a cheater, with only his lover taking his side. No, it wasn't on any of those occasions that he learned life was hard. It was much, much earlier. It was when he first played a video game, when he first saw the two dreaded words, game over, on his screen. It was nothing earth-shattering. He could just restart. But somehow, he couldn't. His young mind learned something that day: heroes didn't always have good endings. No, people didn't always have good endings. He grew up. Every loss he suffered, he got revenge. Everything that was taken from him, he took back, and with interest. The school bullies. They now worked for him, even if they didn't even realize the man they kissed up to was once pushed around by them. The professor who stole his hard work. Now he was the one discredited, overshadowed by his former pupils' accomplishments. His father. He saw him one last time, from afar, and left it at that. Blood is thicker than water, after all. He had been knocked down by life. He had been punched, kicked, beaten by it. But he had fought back, in his own way, and had risen up once more. He was now famous and respected. But there was one failure that still haunted him. The simplest, stupidest of them all, but also the only one he couldn't get past. Game over. How was it fair that just one click could reset everything back to its perfect positions? How was it fair that just one click could wipe everything away? How was it fair that real life wasn't fair? He didn't want to be forgotten. He didn't want to be just another game over. He wanted to leave his mark on the world. He wanted to create heroes. Real heroes. He wanted to be remembered. And he would. His name is Akihiko Kaiba. And he is about to steal 10,000 souls. He is about to turn them into heroes. Ogawa Itsuki had diverse opinions about life. It could be really shitty sometimes, like when your stable job turned out not to be as stable as you thought. It could also be pretty awesome, like when you got the last nerve gear in the shop, after having waited 6.5 hours in line. Watching the people behind him, who had waited just as much, just to come out with empty hands, was even a bit satisfying. He knew he was being a dick for thinking that, but what could he do? It was his way of releasing the stress from almost being one of them. Anyway, Itsuki bolted from the place before anyone had the brilliant idea of trying to snatch his full dive equipment. He wouldn't put it past an angry gamer, and, even if he had the confidence of keeping what he bought, he had bigger things in mind. Such as playing Sword Art Online the moment it launched. Should he be doing that? Probably not. What he should be doing was saving his money and looking for a new job. But after 2 weeks of unfruitful search, he was fed up. Just 2 days. Itsuki promised himself that after 2 days, he would start job hunting again. Unfortunately, life had that already mentioned tendency of throwing curveballs at you from time to time. But that would happen only a few hours from now. Whistling, Itsuki climbed up the stairs to his apartment and unlocked the door. Juggling his newly bought gaming equipment and his bag in one hand, he pushed open the door and flicked the light switch, illuminating the small room. Carefully putting down his things, he went to the annexed kitchen and started preparing a simple lunch. The game would only be released at 1 p.m., so he had time to fill his stomach before jumping in. While opening his fridge to grab the ingredients, Itsuki couldn't help but smile happily. Sure, he was unemployed now, but things weren't so bad. He had a fair bit of money on his account. He had been saving up to buy a car, and now he also had the headgear to play the most groundbreaking and anticipated game of the century. Akihiko Kayaba was a genius. Nobody contested that. He had made many contributions to the field of programming and game design. Hell, just 2 or 3 years ago, he had announced he was developing what was sure to be a worldwide fever, the first ever vrmmorpg. 10 years in the making, Sword Art Online, or SAO, for short, was the first game where your entire consciousness entered the game, allowing 100% immersion, thanks to the full dive technology. While the players' bodies would be sleeping peacefully in the real world, inside SAO they would be living untold adventures. The closed beta, which had stellar reviews from the 1,000 testers, ended just a year ago. Now, November 6 of 2022, the open beta was about to start, enlisting 10,000 players from all around Japan. Presumably, the game would take the world by storm when it was fully released to the public. His thoughts were interrupted by his cell phone ringing. Turning down the heat of the cooktop, he made his way to his bed, where he had carelessly thrown the device, and picked it up. It read, "Ogawa Overlord," on the display. He answered. "Hi, Dad. What's up?" Holding his phone in between his shoulder and head, Itsuki went back to the kitchen, and started multitasking with the expertise of a single young adult. "Nah, I'm doing great. Yes, I'm eating well, tell her not to worry." Turning off the cooktop, he plated his meal, and carried it to the table, which also served as his workstation when he needed to work from home. Ha ha ha. That's very like Mom indeed. I will try to go home for Christmas. Taking his phone off his ear for a quick look at the time, Itsuki realized he had to end the call, or he might not be able to ready everything in time for the launch. "Look, Dad, I've got to go. I have something to do this afternoon." "No, it's not a date." "Haha. Okay, bye. Say bye to Mom too for me. Love you." Putting down his cell phone, Itsuki sighed. He hadn't told his parents he was laid off. He would rather tell them the good news, that he was hired again, whenever that happened. Shaking the depressing thoughts away, Itsuki washed his dishes, and unpacked the nerve gear. The equipment looked like a very bulky helmet, painted with a dark blue color. It wasn't the prettiest of things, but what it represented. Oh, it was freaking awesome. As soon as Itsuki put on the headgear, a voice rang out in his ear, and asked him to do a bunch of calibrations. Running his hands over his body, jumping, speaking different sentences, and a lot more. By the end of the tests, Itsuki was starting to wonder if this wasn't some grand scheme by Kayaba to have everyone in Japan do more cardio. Fortunately, he was now done, and just in time. His phone told him it was 12:56 p.m. already. Laying down, he closed his eyes. Almost immediately he let out a gasp. There, in the top left corner of his vision, were a timer and a battery symbol, even though he should be seeing nothing but darkness. Itsuki anxiously watched the timer go down. When it reached 0, he spoke the activation words he and so many others had burned into their minds. "Link start." Instantly, blinding white substituted the darkness. Various colored lines streaked across his vision, and Itsuki couldn't help but think that SAO lacked an epilepsy warning. When the loading animation ended, he found himself standing in a white room. In front of him were multiple floating customization panels. Through them, he could change his height, his hair, the color of his eyes, the shape of his nose, his entire appearance. Knowing that he would only be able to play SAO sporadically after he got a new job, Itsuki didn't want to waste much time with character customization. After making himself a little taller, because who wouldn't, and his face a little more manly, he looked at himself in the mirror that appeared. What greeted him was a 20-year-old young man with long black hair reaching his shoulders, a squarish face, and dark brown eyes. A very average face, if he was being honest. Very similar to his real self. Confirm character creation. Below the message were a blue circle and a red cross. Selecting the affirmative option, Itsuki saw the panels around him vanish, and a new message popped up. Now, that was a question, wasn't it? Itsuki had played video games before, but his username had always changed, depending on both the type of game and his age. After hesitating for about a minute, he finally decided on what seemed like a fairly good option. Welcome to Sword Art Online, player Drifter. Without warning, everything went white again. When Drifter opened his eyes, he was in a circular plaza. Various old-styled buildings surrounded it, and in the middle an obelisk stood tall. Drifter lowered his sight to himself. He appeared to be wearing a dark green shirt and black pants. His hands were covered by a pair of fingerless gloves. Stretching his fingers, he watched as the material tightened and bent, and felt the touch of his clothes over his skin. Drifter touched his hair, his eyes, his mouth. He felt a smile appearing. Everything was so real. Kayaba, you mad genius. He heard someone snicker to his side, apparently agreeing with his remark, and gave a sheepish smile. Swiping 2 fingers down in a straight vertical line, as the guides he read told him to do, his menu opened. It was a rectangle with a white layout. On the left was a human-shaped figure, with many smaller circles showing the equipment spots. For now, only his torso, legs, and feet were filled. There was also what appeared to be a basic short sword that he could equip, probably the beginner weapon. The menu was complex. There were many subdivisions, such as his stats, equipment, inventory, friends list, skills, and much more. Drifter's head was starting to hurt just by looking at it. Deciding he would leave all that for later, Drifter looked left and right. There were already several hundred people in the plaza, with more spawning in every second, and even though it looked like it would be no problem housing several thousand more, he didn't plan on staying here for that. Already, he could see the quicker players leaving through the alleyways. He chose a random direction and mimicked them. While walking, Drifter equipped the short sword. Suddenly, the weapon appeared in his hands, causing him to stop as he almost let it fall. He wasn't sure what he had expected, maybe for it to feel like a foam sword. It was the very opposite of that. To start with, it was heavy. He could lift it with one hand relatively easily, but just the thought of swinging it already left him tired. It also looked very sharp. His inner psychopath urged him to stab something with it. After admiring his new stab and slice toy, Drifter resumed walking. Soon, he had crossed the gates of the starting city, Town of Beginnings, that was its name, and left the safe area. In front of him was a grassy field and hills. Further north, he could see forests and rivers, as well as a huge, huge pillar. It was said pillar that led to him looking up for the first time since he spawned in. Above his head was a ceiling. Or, rather, the bottom of the floor above. He wasn't about to question how the entirety of the first floor wasn't covered in shadows. That was video game logic for you. It reminded him of the backstory of SAO, though. It was very simple, actually. The players were in Aincrad, a floating castle in the sky, with 100 floors. On the topmost floor, the Ruby Palace, was the big boss of the game. They had to climb through all 100 floors, overcoming countless challenges, to win. Drifter was sure there was a lot more complex lore than that, but that had been as far as he bothered to read. Drifter was brought out of his musings when he heard a high-pitched sound he would later associate with a mob spawning. Just a few meters to his left, a gray-furred hog had appeared. When he looked at it, a red cursor, a health bar, and the words, Frenzy Boar, manifested into existence. The mob seemed to notice him at the same time Drifter did. With a roar, it charged towards him, eyes glowing red. It was very, very real, and very, very terrifying. Drifter froze momentarily, and that allowed the monster to get almost within striking distance of him. It was only then that he remembered to dodge, but failed to do so completely. The tusks of the mob scratched his left side, leaving a red gash and floating polygons, and sent Drifter stumbling. Ah! On the top left corner of his vision, Drifter saw his health bar empty by about 5%, but he was more worried about the girlish scream he had just let out. It had been just a reflex, an instinct, really. You couldn't even feel pain in SAO. Luckily no one was around to hear that, or he would die of shame. Steadying himself, Drifter held his sword with both hands. When the Frenzy Boar charged again, he nimbly stepped to the side, and struck down. The mob cried in pain, and its health bar was depleted by about 20%. Irk! With a last cry of pain, a Frenzy Boar burst into polygons, revealing Drifter, who still had his sword poised in front of his body, the blade parallel to the ground. He had finished off the mob with the skill horizontal, the only ability in his skill tab. Needless to say, it did a lot more damage than normal attacks, even if it was just one single blow. SAO had no such thing as a stamina gauge. You could use as many skills as you liked, however many times you liked. Of course, there were also some drawbacks, the first of them being the cooldown. As far as Drifter could tell, there was an interval after you used a skill during which you could not use it again. He learned that the hard way, when he tried to activate 2 horizontals back-to-back, only to end up frozen, and an easy target for a frenzy boar. Luckily the introductory mobs didn't deal much damage. The second drawback he found was that, while SAO didn't have stamina or mana or the likes, it was very realistic. Meaning, swinging a sword for 2 hours straight, like he had been doing, left you tired as hell, and your arms burning. Closing the screen that told him how much experience, COR, and drops he got, Drifter searched for another target. Maybe someday he would get bored of facing the same mobs, but for now, he still found every fight exciting. Unfortunately for Drifter, what he found when he turned around wasn't another mob, but rather another player. One who was very close to him. Close as in he almost headbutted her when he turned. What the fuck? After jumping back and pointing his sword at the other player, who was giggling, Drifter couldn't help but growl at her. Sorry. I just wanted to talk to you, I didn't think you would turn so suddenly, and... Hi. So sorry, but it was funny how you jumped away. Hi. A few seconds of intense staring later, Drifter sighed and sheathed his sword. That he was carrying a sword on his hip still felt unreal. He was not amused by her antics, but at least the girl wasn't a PKer. So, what did you want to talk to me for? Party with me. That caught Drifter off guard. Not that he was averse to the idea, but it was very sudden. Instead of answering, he scanned the player across from him. Long blue hair, an hourglass-shaped body, and a face that was too pretty to be real. Clearly someone who had spent their sweet time on character customization. Why? I was watching you, and you fight well. I went to that forest over there earlier 'cause of a quest, but almost died. The mobs aren't that strong, but there's a shitton of them. I don't feel like walking back all the way to the town to find a party, so group up with me. Drifter thought for a second, then shrugged. Why not? He had been fighting wild pigs for the last few hours, a change of pace would be nice. Even if the mobs proved to be too much for them to handle, they could just respawn and find more people to help. Send the invite. I'm Drifter, by the way. Cool name. I'm Meowlin. That was a weird name, but Drifter wasn't about to question it. He just accepted the invite, and Meowlin led the way to the quest site. They made some small talk along the way, the girl was very excitable, and killed any of the frenzy boars and dire wolves they met. Drifter had to admit, having a partner made things a lot easier. It was during one such fight, after Drifter had just dispatched the last wolf, that Meowlin took something out of her inventory and threw it to him. Here, catch. By reflex, Drifter did just that. It was a spear. A very basic one on top of that. The shaft was made out of wood, and the head of metal. Curiously enough, despite it being bigger than his sword, it was still lighter. Probably due to it not being made entirely of metal. Drifter looked at its tab, and found out it was called Old Soldier's Spear. Its stats were slightly better than the beginner sword he had. He raised an eyebrow at Meowlin. What's that for? I've been watching you fight. You dodge most of the mobs, which means you probably put quite a few points in DEX when you leveled up. You also tend to stay back and only attack when there's a clear opening. That ain't how you are supposed to fight with a short sword. I got that spear from a quest, and I think it suits you more than me. Drifter maintained his eyebrow raised. That was a very in-depth analysis of his fighting style, for the few minutes they had been together. Heck, she knew more about how he fought than he did. Also, that was the second quest she mentioned. It didn't take too much to figure out who she was. You a beta tester? You caught me. Hi. Meowlin giggled while launching forward to confront another group of mobs. Drifter followed closely behind. I'm guessing this quest ain't so simple, then. If even a beta tester can't finish it alone. Nah, it's pretty straightforward. Exactly what I told you, in fact. Too many mobs for me to deal with alone. I have to kill a large Nepence, and I need you to keep the lesser ones away while I do that. A spear will also give you more reach to do just that, so I'm being a little selfish here. Drifter nodded, and thrust the spear forward, impaling a dire wolf mid-jump, and shattering it into blue sparkles. He swung the weapon, satisfied. Don't sweat it, it's all good. I think you are right, this does fit me more. Anyway, what's the reward? A pretty sweet sword. With the right enhancements, it can last me until floor 6 or maybe even 7. Cool. I will keep the spear as payment for helping you then. Also, you gotta teach me some more later. Deal. Meowlin grinned, her hands behind her back, and Drifter got the sudden feeling that he had been tricked. That sword is worth much more than I think, isn't it? Yes. Hi. Sighing, Drifter decided not to think about it. He had gotten himself a new weapon and a mentor. Could Meowlin be called that? No, should he call her that? Probably not. Anyway, that was something to consider later. Now they were entering the small forest in which the beta tester said the quest objective was located. It didn't take long for them to find the mobs that had sent Meowlin running away with her tail between her legs. Standing at 1.5 meters tall, the monsters looked like a carnivorous plant that was able to walk, and had also received sharp teeth no plant had the right to have. They were also deceptively agile for something whose way of movement was a mass of squirming roots. Being just level 3 mobs, the lesser Nepents and Drifter were technically on the same standing. In fact, they were quite a lot weaker than him. But there were a lot of them. Like, a lot. Meowlin. I need a hand here. Coming. Drifter lifted his spear to block a swipe from one of the mobs, only to have another grab his leg and pull, causing him to fall down. The large monstrosity approached him, saliva dripping from its gross mouth. Drifter could almost see the respawn hall in the town of beginnings, but before the lesser Nepents could deal the fatal blow, Meowlin came in clutch, severing it in 2 halves. Without missing a beat, she turned around to strike at another mob, while Drifter got up. He also didn't waste time into poking the thing with his spear, and emptying the last of its health. Uff. That was terrifying. You tell me. And those aren't even the worst mobs out there. You will see when we get to higher floors. Those are some nightmarish stuff. How far did you get into the beta anyway? Not as far as I would like. Just the 5th floor. I was more invested in searching for secrets and hidden quests than climbing. But I know there were some beta testers who got to floor 8. There was a famous solo player who apparently got to the 10th floor, but I don't know for sure if that's true. Drifter raised an eyebrow. That was becoming a habit. Maybe the difficulty had been turned up since the closed beta, because with how hard grinding was going, Drifter couldn't see how they were supposed to reach the 10th floor in just a month. Well, don't think too hard about it now. Let's get my anneal blade, and then we can finish up for today. Drifter supposed that wasn't a bad idea. He had been going at it for a few hours now. A snack and a bath after finishing this quest didn't sound too bad. Unfortunately, luck didn't seem to be on their side. Even after killing 24 more lesser Nepents and exploring almost all of Harunka Forest, they had yet to find the larger counterpart of the mobs. My spear's durability is running out, Meowlin. We should get back to a city and repair before coming back. We wouldn't have time or want to return here. Let's just try a little more. I promise I will buy you a new weapon if yours break. All right. But I will hold you to that. Watching Meowlin do a victory dance, Drifter sighed and turned around, spotting the biggest walking plant he had seen today. Meowlin. I think I might have found what we are looking for. He pointed a finger at the large Nepents which had just spawned. While it looked very similar to its smaller kind, which was easily 3 meters tall, and towered over all the other mobs. Luckily, they were out of its aggro range. Drifter wasn't sure what he would do if it has spawned right next to him. Nothing honorable, that's for certain. Meowlin, on the other hand, seemed positively ecstatic. Drifter supposed that for a beta tester, the large Nepents was nothing too impressive. Yes. I thought we would have to grind for days before it spawned. Wait, you did. Never mind the details. It's here, so let's take it down before someone KS's. Aim for the spot just above its stalk. There's a higher chance of scoring critical hits. Drifter grabbed Meowlin by the back of the neck before she could rush forward, and pointed a finger to the corner of his vision, where the health bars of his party members was. Both of them were at the lower end of yellow, almost entering red. How about we regen our health first? The beta tester pouted, but sat down to eat and recover. Not much later, they were both back at full health, and ready to rumble. Drifter got up and stretched. What's the plan? You go in first, catch its attention, and keep it at range with your spear. I will go around and flank it, then smack it good. Sounds good. Let's go then. Drifter opened the fight with a horizontal. Although the skill belonged to the one-handed sword category, it still worked with spears. He just had to gather enough momentum to thrust the spear forward with one hand, before pulling it back quickly. The skill poked a large hole through the outer layer of the large Nepent's body. Drifter saw its health dip by about 10%, which was worrying. Against the lesser Nepans, one use of the skill was enough to deplete at least 1/4 of their health gauge. Anyway, though slightly disappointed, Drifter wasn't about to stop. Meowlin had already shared with him that whenever he finished using a skill, he should swap back to ordinary attacks as quickly as possible, lest he be struck while on cooldown. And so that was what he did. Stepping to the left preemptively, Drifter continued his offense with 2 quick stabs, one of which hit the weak point of the mob, causing it to screech in pain and rage. One of the vines that passed as an arm for the creature struck the spot Drifter was just standing on with enough power to carve a hole on the ground. Before it could retreat, Drifter brought his spear up, severing the limb, and sending sap flying everywhere. Unfortunately, he had focused so much on this particular attack that he didn't notice the other arm of the large Nepans, which sent him flying. Though he felt no pain, it was still very disorienting. Also, why did Earth taste like Earth? Did the developers really need to go that far? Besides, that fucker hit really hard. His health was back in the yellow with just a single blow. With the corner of his eye, he saw Meowlin signaling him to distract the mob some more, as if the monster already wasn't hellbent on killing him. Getting up, Drifter groaned, and launched another horizontal, followed by a swipe and a stab. That brought the large Nepan's health down to half. It was then that his partner decided to jump into the fray. With a war cry, Meowlin hit the mob with her own skills, right on its stalk. Suddenly, the health bar above the enemies had dipped to the red, and the large Nepans turned around to deal with the new attacker. Seeing the opening, Drifter used the 3rd horizontal of the battle, and finished it. Yay! We did it. He raised his gaze to Meowlin, a grin hanging on his face. It was a hard battle, but it was worth it if she got the sword. He was about to congratulate her when he froze. His partner of a few hours, the easygoing and hyperactive beta tester, had just burst into polygons mid-commemorative jump. He stared at where Meowlin used to be, dumbfounded. A quick glance at his HUD told him that he was not in a party anymore. And considering that Anil Blade had ended up on his inventory, he didn't think she had ditched him and teleported, if that was even possible. What the hell? For now, the only option Drifter could think of was that Meowlin had been disconnected. Maybe there was a problem with her connection, or, more probably, someone IRL had pulled out her nerve gear. He let out a chuckle imagining a very disgruntled Meowlin pouting at some family member for doing that. Guess I will keep this for her until she logs back in. Stashing away the quest reward, Drifter quickly made his way out of Harunka Forest. This part of the map was too dangerous for single players at this stage, not to mention his gear was almost breaking. Time to get back to the town of beginnings and log out. I can't wait to take a shower. In a room somewhere in Japan, a spectacled man wearing a lab coat analyzed the many computer screens around him. Some were showing prodigious amounts of code running at unparalleled speed. Others showed scenes inside SAO. Others even showed what appeared to news outlets all around the country. The man looked at the screen right in front of him, where a counter was displayed. As he watched, the rightmost number changed. Putting on a nerve gear, the man spoke to no one. Drifter whistled as he walked down the streets of the town of beginnings. He had already repaired his equipment, as well as sold most of the useless drops, keeping only those which could be used as enhancement or crafting materials. He earned a fair bit of COR from that. Of course, he also kept the Anil Blade stashed away from Meowlin. Speaking of which, it was strange that she hadn't logged back in yet. It had been almost half an hour, which should be more than enough time for her to solve whatever problems she had on her end. At the very least, she could pop back in to warn him she wouldn't play anymore today, so he knew whether he should wait or log out too. At the very least, she could send him a message. Weird. I could have sworn we added each other as friends. Opening his menu, he found out that his friends tab was empty, which was definitely strange. He was certain he had accepted the friend request Meowlin had sent him. Maybe it was a bug. It was still a beta version of SAO, after all. While he was pondering, he heard a bell ringing, and his vision suddenly went white, not unlike when he first logged into the game. Next thing Drifter realized, he was back at the plaza in the center of the town of beginnings. Hundreds, no, thousands of players appeared around him. He wouldn't be surprised if all 10,000 of them were here. What the hell? What is happening? Was that a teleport? Drifter wasn't the only one confused. The entire plaza was alight with discussions. Things were messy. It appeared that, like Drifter, they had all been teleported without warning. Some players even seemed to have been whisked away in the middle of a fight, and ended up hitting those around them. Luckily cities were a safe area, otherwise it would have evolved into a massive brawl. Still, something was strange. Drifter shivered, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. He noticed a few people trying to leave the plaza, only to be stopped by a barrier. His focus wasn't on that, however. Instead, his gaze was fixated on the blood-red hexagon that had appeared in the sky, with the word written on it in bold letters. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. Up there. As people raised their heads to look, more hexagons appeared, covering the sky with messages. It was very menacing, and something about it activated Drifter's fight or flee reaction. And he was leaning towards the latter. Suddenly, the system messages started twitching, as if they were glitching. From the space in between them something which looked suspiciously like blood started to drip, causing many players to scream and curse. Then, amidst arcs of lightning, the substance formed a hooded figure which anyone who played an RPG before would recognize. A game master. Attention, players. Welcome to my world. The game master spread his arms wide, as if receiving all of them. But Drifter couldn't think of it as anything other than creepy when he saw that underneath the hood there was nothing. The game master didn't have a face, just a cloud of billowing smoke. And the way he said, "My world. My name is Akihiko Kayaba." Drifter's pupils contracted. That was why the voice sounded so familiar. So, maybe this was just part of the opening ceremony. If it was going to scare more players away than it would bring in. As of this moment, I am the only person able to control this world. Now that sounded ominous. Unconsciously, Drifter started looking for some way to leave, but the barrier was still there stopping them. I'm sure you've already noticed that the logout button is missing from the main menu. There were gasps of surprise as the hubbub that had paused when Kayaba appeared restarted. Drifter couldn't care less. He swiped his fingers down and navigated his menu, only to find out that the game master was speaking the truth. There, where the logout button should have been, was an empty slot. No matter how many times he clicked it, nothing happened. The giant game master in the sky himself demonstrated that. But this is not a defect in the game. I repeat. This is not a defect in the game, but a key feature of Sword Art Online. A key feature. Drifter wasn't sure who said that, but the trepidation in their voice echoed perfectly with how he was feeling. His mind was racing to possibilities, and none of them were good. You cannot log out of SAO on your own will. And no one on the outside can shut down or remove the nerve gear. And there it was, the worst possible outcome he could have imagined. Something in his gut had been telling him that would be the case. They were trapped inside the game, at least until the internal battery of the headgear ended. And Kayaba wasn't finished yet, Drifter could feel it. Should this be attempted, the transmitter inside the nerve gear will emit powerful microwaves, destroying your brain, and thus ending your life. While the crowd erupted in outrage at the ridiculous threat, Drifter collapsed. They couldn't log out. If someone tried to take off the nerve gear, the player would die. Whether this was true or not, and it was very likely to be, then it explained why she disappeared from his friends list. Miaolin. The cheerful girl who had scared him the first time they met, the friendly beta tester who was willing to give him a weapon that suited him better, and to teach him the mechanics of the game, who was so happy to get a new sword. She was dead. She was dead because someone, probably a family member, had innocently decided to take off her nerve gear. Oh gods, he couldn't even imagine how much guilt they would feel when they realized they had killed their own family. No, not them. The one who murdered Miaolin wasn't her family. It was the bastard towering above him right now, as if he were some kind of god. Akihiko Kayaba. Drifter's head snapped back to the monster passing as a human being above the plaza. With pure anger as fuel, he forced himself to stand up. Kayaba wasn't finished just yet. Unfortunately, there have been several instances where players' friends and families have ignored this warning, and attempted to forcibly remove the nerve gear. As a result, 213 players have exited permanently, from both Aincrad and the real world. What? This isn't funny, man. Wah. Even before Kayaba finished speaking, several hundred voices were already confronting and cursing him. Drifter was not one of them. As much as he hated it, he believed what the developer was saying. And that was before he showed several news feeds reporting the fatalities. As you can see, news organizations across the world are reporting on this situation, including the multiple deaths. Thus, you can assume that the danger of a nerve gear being removed has been reduced. Drifter scanned the screens floating in the sky with watery eyes. One of them was Miaolin. Even if he hadn't known her very well, or at all, he still felt pain. He might not have known it at the time, but the moment she was reduced to polygons, she had died. He watched her die in front of his very eyes. He felt sick. So, I would like you all to focus on clearing the game. Clearing the game. But be sure to keep this in mind. There is no longer any function to revive someone within the game. The instant your HP drops to 0, your avatars will vanish forever. And simultaneously. There was a dramatic pause after that, during which Drifter could only think that this was much, much worse than the worst-case scenario he had imagined. Your brains will be destroyed by the nerve gear. Instantly, Drifter's mind was filled with images of the time he almost died today, when fighting the large Nepans. So, he had actually come this close to dying in real life. The one condition for your escape is to complete this game. You are presently on the lowest floor of Aincrad, floor 1. If you make your way through the dungeon and defeat the floor boss, you may advance to the next level. Defeat the final boss on floor 100 and you will clear the game. Kayaba summoned a hologram of Aincrad to illustrate his words, but Drifter wasn't paying attention to it. Even he knew that clearing all 100 floors of Aincrad was impossible. No, maybe it could be done, but how long would it take? Would they have to spend years trapped inside Sword Art Online? What about their lives, their families outside? And how many people would perish before they could complete their goal? If they could clear it at all, that is. Now then, finally, I've provided you all with a present in your item storage. Please see for yourselves. Drifter didn't want to. Everything Kayaba told them to do, he wished to do the exact opposite. But he knew that throwing a tantrum would change nothing at this point, so he opened his inventory with a sigh. Sitting there was a hand mirror. As soon as he held it in his hands, the mirror started glowing, and surrounded Drifter with a pillar of light. The same was happening to everyone else, even those who hadn't taken out the item. When the bright light faded away, Drifter didn't feel any different, until he glanced at the mirror. Reflected on it was his face. Not his in-game face, but how he looked like in real life. Just as shocked as everyone else, Drifter couldn't help but wonder, how and why. Somewhere behind him, he heard someone talking about calibration and whatnot. Which brought Drifter to his second question. And he was sure Kayaba would answer that, like the megalomaniac he was proving to be. Right now, you all must be wondering, why? Why would Akihiko Kayaba, developer of Sword Art Online and the Nerve Gear, do such a thing? Though the tone of voice didn't change, Drifter could almost hear the bastard chuckling. My goal has already been achieved. I created Sword Art Online for one reason. To create this world and meddle in it. Kayaba. And now, all is complete. This ends the tutorial for the official Sword Art Online launch. I wish you luck, players. From the corner of his vision, Drifter could see the gigantic game master disappearing, but he wasn't paying attention. He pushed his way through the dumbstruck crowd, and managed to get out of the plaza, now unobstructed by the barrier, just as the first despair-filled scream rang. He started running without aim, until the claustrophobic feeling was gone. Inside the plaza, he felt trapped in all senses of the word. When he came to his senses, Drifter realized he had ended up on the southern edge of the town of beginnings, where Aincrad met the nothingness below. It was a breathtaking view, the clouds dyed red and orange by the sunset. On any other occasion, he would have been stunned into silence by the beauty of it. Now, he could only think that the sunset looked like blood. Hey! Shishio! Don't do that. As more players appeared, presumably after having tried to escape the plaza like him, Drifter saw one man walking towards the edge of the floating castle determinedly. Behind him was another player, who seemed to be trying to stop the one called Shishio. When the player put his hands over the railing, Drifter realized what was going to happen a second before everybody else, and sprinted toward the duo. Fuck off. I don't believe what that madman said. We will die in real life if we die in-game. Bullshit. He was too late. Shishio slapped away his friend's hands before climbing the railing. He hesitated for half a second before taking a determined step forward, and falling. Drifter reached the edge just in time to see Shishio's body dissipating in polygons after hitting the invisible barrier a few hundred meters below Aincrad. Shishio. Stumbling back, Drifter crouched, and held his head in his hands. Another one. That was another person who died right before his eyes. He got up with a start, turned, and ran. Away from the sunset, away from other people. Chapter 4, Partnership November 7, 2022, Afternoon. Drifter dragged his tired feet through the gate of the town of beginnings. The streets were empty, and not for good reasons. Most players were holed up in the inns, spending what little COR they had in the hopes that they would soon wake up in their beds, and be told everything was just a prank. Drifter didn't hold that illusion. Especially since there was another reason the streets were empty. About 24 hours had passed since Akihiko Kayaba announced their imprisonment in the deadly game known as Sword Art Online. Where in the closed beta once stood the respawn hall, now was a black stele, covered in names. The Monument of Life. Ironically, it was filled with the names of dead people. The monument was probably supposed to be used to know who was still alive and who wasn't. But little more than a day after the launch of SAO, almost 400 names had been crossed, their causes of death written next to them. Most were suicide or forced disconnection. Pushing open the door of his inn, Drifter sat at a corner table and ordered something to eat. The cheapest bread available at the market might sate his hunger, but if he was going to fight for his life, he wanted a decent meal. The NPC waitress brought him his food, and with it also came an undesirable visitor. Drifter barely lifted his eyes to look at the small figure who had sat across from him. After glancing at her, he started eating. Oi. Dri boo. That ain't nice, ignorant a lady like that. Sighing, Drifter lifted his head from his food, and gave a good look over at the annoying girl. She was small, shorter than his shoulders. Her golden brown hair was messy, and covered with a tattered hood. He had to squint his eyes to see the face underneath. The girl was actually quite pretty, with a perky nose, thin lips, and brown eyes which seemed to shine. He had to look very deep into them to find the despair he and every other player felt. Are those whiskers? Painted on the girl's face were 3 pairs of what looked very much like cat whiskers. Apparently that was the right thing to ask, though, because a sly smile lit her expression. Ho ho. Wouldn't you like to know? Afraid that's gonna cost you way more than you have on ya. Okay. I'm not really that interested anyway. With that, Drifter resumed eating. The girl opened and closed her mouth, unsure of how to react, until she noticed his lips trembling slightly. She slammed the table. You're playin' me. With that, Drifter couldn't hold it anymore. He chuckled, which sounded southwest out of place in Aincrad that even the NPCs in the inn looked at him as if he was a weirdo. Most probably chalked it up to a mental breakdown. Yeah, sorry, but gods, I needed that. I couldn't resist it when you started talking like a gangster. Or tried to, anyway. So, to what do I owe the pleasure? Humph. The name's Argo. I have a proposition for ya. Drifter had to give a thumbs up to the girl, she recovered fast. He couldn't even enjoy her stunned expression, since she, Argo, was it. Put on a business face, complete with a predatory grin and everything. I feel like I'm about to get scammed. Do go on, please. Gotta get straight to the point with ya, I'm an infobroker. Infobroker. Yeah. I buy and sell intel to other players. Huh. And what's that gotta do with me? I want you to be one of my sources. That got Drifter's attention. He pushed his plate aside, and focused completely on Argo. Why? Kazuya, Spearman Drifter, is one of the few players who hasn't given in to despair, or given up on clearing this hellish game. While most people are mopping about or crying or cursing, you stepped out of the city first thing in the morning, and spent the whole day grinding, even if a single mistake might cost you your life. Drifter's pupils contracted. That the girl across from him knew his name, weapon, and what he did today, while he knew absolutely nothing about her, was worrying, to say the least. Argo noticed his reaction, because her grin widened. Drifter didn't ask how she knew all this information, she had already told him what her job was. All right, you have my interest. What do you want? Information. I'm damn good at what I do, but fightin' ain't my thing. I want you to sell me intel about the mobs you fight, their attack patterns, their weaknesses, their drops. I want you to send me maps of the new areas, tell me how to activate and complete new quests, and everything else. Even intel on other players. Don't be thinking any information you have is useless. Come to me, and I will tell you whether it's good or not, and I'll buy it at a fair price. Drifter nodded. It made sense. And, of course, if any other player wanted to know about him, Argo would also sell his intel to them. Well, better build a good relationship with her then. Though she seemed very money-minded, it might stop her from selling anything too important if she considered him a friend, or, at least, a valuable source. He still had his reservations, though. I'm tempted to accept, Argo. But I want to know if my intel is going to be used to scam other players, cause if that is the case, I won't be joining in this enterprise. Also, I want your guarantee you will only sell verified intel. Enough people are going to die already, and I don't want to be the reason behind some of those. He was pushing it, he knew. The infobroker had come to him to make a proposition, not to have restrictions imposed on herself. It would be very understandable if she got up and left now. Even more so if she started to badmouth him to other players. But unexpectedly, Argo smiled. The first real smile he saw her show today, not those fake ones which didn't reach her eyes. Normally that would cost you some COR, but fair is fair. For the sake of a good partnership, Imma answer those 2 questions of you for free. Her grin told him there was something else to it, something she didn't want to share just yet. On my reputation as an info broker, I promise you that any intel I sell will be verified to be true first, or, if not that, will come along with a warning. Drifter nodded. He supposed time would tell if the girl was being honest or not, but he liked the feeling she gave. What about selling other players' information? Mine, for example. Argo didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at him with a twinkle in her eyes so obvious, Drifter felt ashamed he didn't catch it faster. With a sigh, he took 100 COR out of his inventory, which manifested as a small bag, and threw it across the table. Argo put it away with a smirk. I choose my clients well. That was enough for Drifter. He started eating again, and, in between each mouthful, started describing all the mobs he had fought today, as well as the 2 gathering quests he had done. To top it off, he sent Argo a map of the areas he had been to. All the while, the info broker was typing away on empty air, probably taking notes with her menu set for private. When he was finished, Argo opened a trade screen with him, and put 426 COR in it. A very specific amount, and more than he was expecting, considering everything he told her the girl could have easily obtained herself. Not that he was complaining. That's about all I have. Gotcha. It was great doing business with ya, Dri boo. Remember, if you have any questions, just message me. Little ol' Argo will tell ya all you want to know. For the right price, of course. Of course. The 2 shared a laugh. Their conversation had been helpful, if nothing else. At least, Drifter knew he wasn't the only one who hadn't given up. If not a friend, Argo would be a good ally to have, even if it was just to banter sometimes. Ah, take this, Dri boo. A souvenir all my buyers get. Also, here's a freebie for ya, find people you can trust. SAO ain't a game where you get far alone. The way Argo so correctly spoke that last sentence told him how serious she was being. He firmly nodded at the departing figure before turning his attention to the booklet she had given him. On the cover it simply said, Guidebook First Edition. Underneath the title was a symbol that looked suspiciously like 3 pairs of whiskers. Leafing through, Drifter's eyebrows shot up. It was exactly what the title indicated. A guide to surviving Aincrad's first floor. Every bit of information Drifter had just sold Argo, and much more, was there. Quests he had never learned about, materials that required specific ways of killing the mobs to drop, even intel on labyrinth monsters, though that last one had a very big warning next to it saying, yet to be verified. On the last few pages was a sketch of what looked like a giant wolfman, holding an axe. Over its head, in blood-red font, it said, First Floor Boss Ilfang the Kobold Lord. Next to it was once again the, yet to be verified. It described all of the boss's attack patterns and moves. Closing the booklet and storing it away for a later read, Drifter rubbed his temples. His talk with Argo, and especially this last gift she gave him, told him a lot. First of all, the info broker wasn't so selfish and greedy as she wanted to pass as, since she was distributing what was essentially a guide to survival. Secondly, she was very serious about what she did. Everything was described clearly and in detail. Third, Argo was probably a beta tester. Drifter didn't have any proof to actually support the last claim, but it made sense. If she wasn't a beta tester, how would she know about the boss's skill set? Getting up, Drifter opened his menu and sent her a quick thanks. She would understand. Then, he walked upstairs, to the room he had already rented yesterday. Once there, he unequipped his weapon and armor, and fell into bed. With a swipe of his fingers, he opened his character page. Just before returning to the city, Drifter had reached level 5. It might seem like good progress, considering it was just the 2nd day of the game, but for him, it wasn't nearly enough. In a world where higher numbers equated to a better chance of survival, he was still too weak. After reading Argo's booklet, and comparing with what he experienced today, Drifter arrived at one conclusion: he needed to leave the town of beginnings. The mobs around the safe city were already below his level. If he wanted to get stronger faster, he needed to explore the first floor. Maybe even the labyrinth that connected to the floor above, though that was something to consider in the future. After looking at his status, Drifter opened the skill tab. Horizontal was still there, but Searching and Rage Spike had been added to the list. The former was used for scouting and discovering monster tracks or hidden mechanisms. The latter was a basic combat skill that allowed him to jump forward, followed by an upward strike. Both were incredibly useful, in their own ways. The sun shining through the window woke up Drifter. He fumbled around with his menu for a while, before managing to open it, and immediately groaned. Why did SAO have to be that accurate? It was just 6:30 in the morning. Fighting the urge to fall asleep again, Drifter got up and stretched. Shaking his head, he walked downstairs and had a quick breakfast, before leaving the inn. He walked slowly through the town of beginnings, checking out what the NPCs were selling, visiting the blacksmith to make sure his weapon and armor were at max durability, and stocking up on potions. Eventually, he realized he was just wasting time because he was scared. Leaving the city to grind yesterday was one thing. He could come back at any moment, and hide in his room, never leaving until someone cleared the game, or his real body gave out. But once he set foot on the path to the other cities on the first floor, and the labyrinth beyond it, there would be no turning back. Figuratively, that is. He could always return here whenever he wanted, but it would just be lying to himself. Having second thoughts, boo. To his credit, Drifter jumped only a few feet in the air when he heard the cheeky whisper right next to his ear. Then, immediately after, he turned to glare at the info broker, who was doubling over laughing. Argo. That scared the crap out of me. Shishishishi. Don't give me that wheezing laugh. It isn't funny. It is a little bit, yeah, boo. Shishishi. Throwing his hands up in defeat, Drifter stared at Argo until she stopped giggling. He felt like pulling out her fake whiskers to teach her a lesson, but had the distinct feeling he would regret it a lot if he did so. I'm done, boo. What's up with the way you call me? Can't you just call me Drifter? Like, a normal person. But then it doesn't seem like we are close. 'Cause we aren't. Ah. You're gonna break my heart if you talk like that, boo. Drifter opened and closed his mouth a few times before deciding the path of least opposition was the best path in this situation. You know what, I can't be bothered. And yes, I am having second thoughts, Argo. But I think I'm over them already. Drifter expected a snarky remark from the info broker. She seemed to be good at those. But when he didn't hear from her in the next few seconds, he looked down, curious. Argo was staring at him, any sign of her previous mischievous attitude gone. It was unnerving. What is it? If you don't want to do it, then don't, Drifter. Consider as if our deal never happened. I don't want your death in my consciousness. Those chocolate brown eyes of hers showed that Argo was being completely serious. They held a hint of concern he wasn't used to seeing. She was really worried for him. That warmed Drifter's heart. It also broke it when he gave a good look at her face, and realized Argo was young. Maybe 15. Before he could stop himself, Drifter had reached for her head. Pushing her hood back, he slowly caressed her curly locks. Like a scared animal, Argo seemed almost ready to jump back, but stopped. After a few tense seconds, she allowed him to continue, and even got closer to him. I'm afraid, Argo. Afraid I will die. Also, afraid others will die in front of me, or worse, because of me, and that I won't be able to do anything to stop it. And you are the same, aren't you? The info broker was facing the ground, but Drifter heard something that sounded suspiciously like a sniffle before she nodded. Drifter smiled fondly, and, as he would do to a little sister, pulled Argo into a one-armed hug, his other hand still ruffling her hair. I don't know why you are doing what you are, Argo, but I know you want to help others. To help everyone escape. That's why you are working so hard when pretty much everyone else is hiding. And I also want to help. Help the other players, and help you. Can't be having a little girl like you do all the hard work, can I? Humph. I'm tougher than you. Ha ha. That you are. Drifter laughed, his first real laughter since their imprisonment started. When Argo pushed him away, and definitely did not secretly wipe her eyes, he figured he had at least 2 reasons to beat SAO. To survive, and to make sure Argo survived. I will be seeing you around, little rat. Save your COR, because I will bring you the hottest pieces of information on this side of Aincrad. You better, boo. Otherwise I will fire your arse. Ha 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 ha. When he stepped out of the gate and out of the safe zone, Drifter thought he heard Argo tell him to take care, but when he turned to look, the info broker was nowhere to be seen. He turned his gaze to the pillar in the distance. A smile tugged at his lips. This world doesn't seem so bad anymore. Decidedly more determined and resolute, Drifter started walking with purpose. As soon as the first dire wolf spawned, he slipped his spear off his back, and held it with both hands. The entire weapon glowed red as he got into the right stance to activate Rage Spike. He lunged forward, covering the few meters between him and the mob in an instant, and brought his weapon up in a violent vertical strike, which sent the wolf up in the air, a red gash appearing on its body. Before it could land, Drifter had already stabbed it once again, resulting in a cloud of polygons. The second and third dire wolves were greeted by a horizontal no sooner than they appeared, and dispatched with the same cold efficiency as the first one. Drifter put away his spear with a flourish. "Talbana, here I come, huff. Huff." Somewhere on the first floor, but also not quite there, another battle was unfolding. A young man with black hair, wearing blue clothes and a chest plate, was holding a one-handed sword, facing off against a group of monsters. If Drifter was there, he would recognize the mobs as the ruined kobolds he read about in Argo's guide. Dodging a pike, the swordsman closed in on one of the mobs, his weapon glowing blue, and hit it with a 4 strikes combo, killing the kobold. Then, the black-haired youth seamlessly connected another skill, followed by 2 normal strikes, and eliminated the remaining mob. Throughout the entire fight, his health never dropped below green. Sitting with his back against a wall, the player stopped to rest for a while. Soloing entire patrols of ruined kobolds wasn't something easy, not even for him. As he pulled a piece of bread and some sauce from his inventory, he realized he had a new message. Whilst in combat, you wouldn't be notified of messages. Even Kayaba seemed to think that would be an idiotic way to die. Argo. He knew only 2 people in the game, and maintained contact with just one of them, so the swordsman couldn't help but wonder what piece of information the info broker wanted to sell him. Much to his surprise, that wasn't what was happening. "Argo, got an interesting guy here, Kibu. Goes by Drifter, uses a spear. Keep an eye out for him, I get the feeling you are gonna like each other." Argo must have used the speech-to-text function of the message system, because it was so hard to read he could almost hear her voice. Also, Argo the Rat, as she was known during the beta, giving information without asking for payment. Aincrad must be floating upside down. Besides, the way she worded it, it sounded an awful lot like she was asking a favor. Which just couldn't be true. Argo didn't owe others. Right. Shaking his head, the swordsman got up. That was something to think about later, in the safety of his room in the inn. Argo asked him to keep an eye out for this Drifter, and keep an eye he shall. Readying his sword, he made his way deeper into the labyrinth. SAO wasn't going to beat itself, Talbana was a surprise. Drifter wasn't sure what he had been expecting when he set off for the second largest city on the first floor, but it definitely wasn't for it to be bustling with player activity. The city had that dusty, old vibe going for it, but that was ruined by how many people were walking around. In the short few minutes since he arrived, he had seen at least several dozen players, more than he met in the entirety of the town of beginnings yesterday. Sure, the people here weren't smiling and laughing either, but they definitely felt more alive. He supposed it made sense. Anyone who reached Talbana so soon after the game started couldn't be a mediocre player. From the town of beginnings to here, you had to cross many different maps, several of which could prove to be deadly to anyone unprepared. Also, Talbana was just half an hour away from the entrance of the first floor's labyrinth. Drifter guessed most of the people here were aiming to clear the game, and that was why they felt so different from what he had become used to. They had yet to give in to despair, or, if they did, they hid it well. They had a sense of purpose. "Howdy, friend. Don't suppose you would be interested in an upgrade?" Drifter stopped to look at the tower of a man who called him. Standing at, the very least, 2 meters tall, the player was bald, and had a huge grin on his face. And, if his height wasn't enough of an oddity in Japan, he was also black. His Japanese was fluent, but still carried a bit of an accent, so Drifter inferred he wasn't originally from the country. All that went through Drifter's mind in a flash, thanks to all the job interviews he has to take. It paid off to observe your possible employer. A slightly better answer than the next person could be the difference between being hired or not. He felt like he should behave much the same with the giant in front of him. "Thanks, but I'm good." Politely declining, Drifter stepped around the big man. The player also didn't make his life difficult, just nodding. "No problems. I'm Agile, a merchant in the works. If you ever need anything, come to me and I will try to find it for you. By the way, just a piece of advice, if you are planning on taking on the labyrinth, it would do you good to do an overhaul of your gear. The mobs in there are a lot tougher than the ones outside. Speaking from experience here. I will keep that in mind. See you around." Agile waved at Drifter before returning to the shadow where he had been rested. He appeared to have set up a small shop over there, with some weapons and materials on display. It seemed the hopeful merchant was keeping an eye on Talbana's entrance for any new players like Drifter. Making a mental note to come back here some other time, if for no reason other than to show some support as thanks for the well-intentioned warning, Drifter continued strolling through the city. He saw a player blacksmith, someone else buying drops and enhancement materials, one girl trying to sell what seemed like meat skewers, and even someone playing a flute. Drifter couldn't help but marvel at humankind's adaptability. 3 days stuck in a death game, and they had not only accepted it, but were forming a society. After repairing his spear at the NPC blacksmith, he didn't quite trust beginning players to repair his only weapon. Drifter went to that player who was buying monster drops, and sold his. Finally, he bought 2 skewers, he didn't even want to know what they were made of, and sat at the central plaza of Talbana, listening to the musician player. The girl was too good for that to be a skill. She probably played the flute in real life, and quite well at that. Munching on a surprisingly good meat skewer while listening to music with his eyes closed, feeling the breeze on his face, Drifter relaxed. Moving on from the town of beginnings had been the right decision. When the musician ended her piece, Drifter applauded lightly, even if others looked at him weirdly. Anyone who came to what could effectively be considered the front lines of SAO, only to play music and lift others' spirits, deserved at least that much. Thank you very much. The applause seemed to be unexpected even for the one receiving it, because the girl was startled before showing a beautiful smile, and bowing. She walked in his direction to thank her audience. The flutist had milky tea-brown hair, and a pretty doll-like face. 2 dimples appeared on her face when she smiled. That, coupled with her simple sky-blue dress and white mantle, gave her a very innocent vibe, and Drifter couldn't help but smile too. You deserve it. What song was that? It was very nice to listen to. Ah, I composed it myself. It doesn't have a name yet. Drifter raised an eyebrow. So the girl wasn't just talented. She was very talented. Well, when you find the right title, I would very much like to hear it again. Thank you. Hey, Yuna. Come on, let's get lunch. From the other side of the plaza, someone yelled for the girl. Yuna, a fitting name. Drifter smiled and gestured with his head towards the boy who was calling for her. It was a pleasure to listen to you play, Yuna. The girl smiled, and nodded another wordless thanks. She had taken a few steps towards her companion when she glanced back, and saw Drifter had resumed staring at the sky. Biting her bottom lip, she ran back. You know, I plan on playing more at the restaurant later, after lunch. You are more than welcome to join us. I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't. To be honest, you are the first person who stopped to listen to my songs. I feel like I will regret it in the future if I don't treat my first fan to a meal. Switching his gaze between Yuna's face and her outstretched hand, Drifter pondered for all of 2 seconds. Then he grabbed the offered hand, and pulled himself up. 3 days. That was how long Drifter had been stuck in Sword Art Online. But it might as well have been forever. The first 2 days felt like an eternity as he was too busy wallowing in self-pity. The 3rd day, when he decided to do something about it, wasn't so bad. He traveled to a new city, one where the air itself wasn't heavy with fear and sadness, and where players walked with a sense of purpose. He also made a new friend. When he first met Yuna, about 15 minutes ago, his first impression was that of a pure, gentle young lady. That hadn't changed. But after talking with her for a while and being invited to lunch, he also added another quality to the growing list of adjectives in his head: kind. The songstress gleefully introduced him to her companion, a young player named Nautilus. He had dirty brown hair and the starts of an immature stubble on his chin. He seemed less than thrilled that Drifter would be joining them, though he raised no objection. His eyes kept darting to Drifter's face as they walked, nervously turning away whenever he turned to him. Drifter didn't need to be a genius to see that Nautilus had very low self-esteem, and was very uncomfortable around others who were not Yuna. Speaking of the musician, Drifter raised an eyebrow at her and gestured subtly at Nautilus, asking silently if he should leave. His answer was a mischievous wink, which allowed him to know that Yuna was aware of Nautilus's problem, and had invited him in the hopes of getting the boy to open up. Drifter went along with it. It was the least he could do to repay Yuna after the girl decided to treat him to lunch. They made some small talk along the way, Nautilus only ever talking when Yuna pulled him into the conversation. Seeing how he relaxed whenever that happened, Drifter guessed the two were old friends in real life. Here we are. Yuna's cheerful announcement caused more than a few heads to turn when they entered the restaurant, and more than one gaze lingered on her. It was nothing uncommon to see beautiful avatars in other games, but after Kaiba's little mirror stunt, everyone in SAO had their real appearances, meaning Yuna was just as pretty here as she was in real life. Not that anybody was in the mood to flirt these days, especially after seeing she already had company. The trio sat on one of the tables closer to the small stage at the back of the restaurant, where an NPC was currently playing a merry melody that did not at all fit the mood of most players. Yuna seemed to like it though, and was humming along. Drifter looked inquisitively at Nautilus, as if asking if she always did that, and for the first time the quiet player showed an emotion other than anxiety when facing Drifter. With a small smile, he nodded lightly. Drifter returned the gesture, then raised his hand to call for a waiter. He intended on putting on his order, but a small hand firmly grasped his wrist, and wrestled his arm down. He glanced at the songstress, who was glaring at him in what she probably thought was a menacing way, but which Drifter could only classify as too cute. "I invited you. It's my treat." Her stern tone of voice left no room for refusal, so Drifter could only shake his head helplessly. "All righty, then. Don't blame me for burning a hole in your wallet though." Although he said that, Drifter chose one of the cheapest meals on the menu. Like all other players, Yuna didn't have had too much COR at hand, so she didn't insist he got something better. Her frown gone, she happily called the waiter. The way restaurants worked in SAO, the moment you put in your order, you would receive a prompt to pay for the meal, so in this case, the girl had to order for all three of them. Like always, the food arrived quickly. Since the cooks inside the kitchen were probably just willing it into existence, Drifter didn't understand why they didn't just make it appear on their table directly. An attempt at realism, maybe. Not that he was complaining, it was always better to get your meal delivered to you quickly. "I have to say, I didn't think I would find someone like you here, Yuna." "What do you mean?" "Well, you are a musician." "No offense, but in a world of sword fighting, that was not what I was expecting." "Not that I dislike it, though. That song you were playing was just what I needed after traveling from the town of beginnings to Talbana. I didn't realize how tense I was until I relaxed because of it." Yuna beamed at the praise, and even Nautilus smiled, as if he had been the one to be complimented. It seemed that anything related to Yuna was reason to make him happy. Drifter silently mused that, while the two young players weren't in a relationship, at least one of them was interested in the other. But it didn't concern him, so he pushed the thoughts to the back of his mind. It's a support skill, musical instruments. It's in the same category as forging, cooking, carpentry, appraisal, and so on. I see. I kinda ignored those in favor of combat skills. Cooking, though. I might pick that one up. Oh. Do you like cooking? Drifter took a sip of his drink, and nodded to Nautilus, who seemed suddenly interested in the topic. Yeah. Always did. Though I only started taking it more seriously after I moved out of my parents' house. After 2 weeks of only eating instant noodles, I made a point of always having some ingredients at home, so I could have some variety, even if it's just something quick. Whoa. That's impressive. My dad never let me close to the kitchen. EI. Not is a great cook, though. Isn't that right? Really? We will have to test that someday. Drifter purposely ignored the slight slip of the tongue. He also hadn't told anyone his real name. For as long as he stayed in SAO, he would be just Drifter. Sharing little things like his love of cooking wasn't much, but anything more personal was. Well, personal. No matter how realistic SAO was, it was not the real world. He couldn't forget that. He had the feeling that if he did, he would never get out. Still, beautiful as your music is, why are you here in Talbana? What? Why can't we be here? That seemed to rub Yuna the wrong way. She pouted, and, unlike the fake glare from before, this time she was mad for real. Across from Drifter, Nautilus had crossed his arms in an uncharacteristic display of annoyance. There was also some worry hidden in his eyes. And Yunus too, spotted Drifter when he caught the two of them exchanging glances. Looks like he touched a sore spot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. It's just. Most of the players here, myself included now, are here because of the labyrinth to the second floor. It's dangerous. Humph. And you think we can't take care of ourselves? Drifter knew he should stop before he really pissed them off. He still wanted to listen to her music, after all. But he had already watched 2 players die in front of him. Admittedly, there was nothing he could do in either case, but it didn't make him feel any less useless, and he would do everything in his power to prevent more deaths. I know you aren't weak, Yuna, Nautilus. If you were, you would have never reached Talbana, and would still be stuck in the town of beginnings. But you are focusing on a support skill, so your fighting capabilities can't be too strong. What about me? I am a pure fighter. I can protect her. Drifter switched his gaze from Yuna to Nautilus, who had forgotten his shyness and slammed the table. The player twitched when Drifter stared at him but didn't back down. Finally, Drifter sighed, got up, bowed, and prepared to leave. I really hope so. I don't want to have another name disappear from my friend list. Thanks for the meal. The duo stared at him, confusion clear in their expressions, as the implications of what Drifter just said sunk in. He sighed again, and turned around after giving them one last glance. Before he could take 2 steps, he felt someone grabbing him by the back of the collar of his shirt. You haven't added us as friends yet. Now, Drifter might have understood if Yuna was the one to grudgingly grumble those words. It would be very in character for her. But it came as a big surprise when Nautilus pulled him back and forced him to seat back down. What? You haven't added us as friends yet. You won't even know if we die if you don't. Now Drifter was properly befuddled. He had just spoken a lot of harsh words, so why the hell was that their take? Also, was it pity he saw in their eyes? Player Yuna has sent you a friend request. Accept. Player Nautilus has sent you a friend request. Accept. Struggling to understand this new development, Drifter looked at his 2 new acquaintances. Nautilus had reverted back to his nervous manners after the outburst, and Yuna appeared hopeful. Drifter got lost in her warm eyes for a few seconds, his fingers hovering over the no button until he clicked. Yes. His first 2 friends appeared on the list on his menu. Well, Argo should probably be considered his first friend, but it had slipped both of their minds to send a friend request to each other. Drifter corrected that right away. While waiting for her to accept, he turned back to Yuna, who was smiling joyfully. Yay. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Drifter shook his head. How could this girl look so ethereal when playing music, and so endearingly silly and cute at other moments? If you don't mind me asking, Drifter, did you lose someone? It's all right if you don't want to answer. Drifter gave a comforting grin to Nautilus, though it didn't reach his eyes, and both of his table companions noticed it. The ash-brown-haired player stuttered, probably readying an apology, but Drifter stopped him. You could say so, but also not. It was on the first day, before Kayaba's announcement and everything that followed. I was in a party with this girl. We had just completed a quest, and she was celebrating. And then she just disappeared. Someone on the other side forcefully disconnected her. Drifter knew that was the case, because he had looked for and found Meowlin's name in the Memorial of Life. The memories weren't pleasant, and not for the first time since getting trapped in SAO, Drifter wished the NPC sold something stronger than juice. His depressing mood must have shown, because Drifter felt a hand on top of his. He looked up from the stain on the table he had been intently staring at, and saw Yuna smiling at him. She didn't try to fake the fact that it was forced, and she also didn't try to comfort him. Instead, the songstress picked up her flute, and walked towards the stage. After a short few hushed words with the musician, the NPC let Yuna take his place. Her eyes never leaving his, she brought the flute up to her lips, and started playing. A soft, calming melody left the instrument. It started quietly, but seemed to gain strength the more she played, and soon everyone in the restaurant had turned to listen. Yuna swayed lightly to her own music, while Drifter watched unblinking. The melody was at the same time sad but captivating, and Drifter, and not just a few other players, clenched their hands and tried, in a futile effort, to stop their tears from falling. Yuna was also crying as she played. When she ended the song, a last melancholic note echoing gravely in the silent restaurant, there was no applause. Yuna seemed to be in a stupor, and only broke out when a system message popped up in front of her. Her eyes widened as she read, before she rapidly typed something. Only then she turned to the 10-odd customers who were looking at her. In their eyes, she saw reflected her own emotions. This song is called Rest. It is a promise to all who couldn't make it, now and after. May they rest finally in peace, because we will live on. They will be with us, their memories the force that drives us to beat this game and escape this prison. Thank you. Yuna bowed, and stepped down the stage. She received several nods of acknowledgement in return, and Drifter knew that was better than any applause. He himself nodded resolutely, and gave her hand a light squeeze when she returned to the table. Meanwhile, Nautilus handed Yuna a handkerchief he got from who knows where. Don't worry, Yun. We will survive this. I will make sure of it. I trust you, not. And you too, Drifter. It wasn't your fault, and you know that. Yeah. Doesn't make it any less upsetting, though. But your song, it helped. You were right. We will beat this game, and get out of this hell. Yuna smiled, then, seemingly remembering something, pulled up her menu. Neither Drifter nor Nautilus could see what she was doing thanks to the privacy setting, but she seemed to be looking for something. And she found it. This. What happened? When I finished the song, there was a prompt for me to name it. Apparently, now it is part of my repertoire. Kinda like a skill. It's under musical instruments. Drifter and Nautilus exchanged glances. The younger boy couldn't help but question her. Like a skill. Then what are its effects? Air. Healing. Whenever I play it, anyone in my party will get a passive health regeneration effect. It doesn't say how much it actually heals, though. Hiss. We have to test that. And also, we can't let anyone find out about it. I know a certain rat who would pay a fortune for that information. And would also sell it for a fortune. Drifter and Nautilus both seemed to have the same idea, because they sneakily peered at the other clients, worried someone would overhear their conversation. Drifter is right, Yuna. In a world where the only way to heal is through potions, you are basically a health-restoring machine. I can't even imagine what people would do to get you in their parties if they discovered that. You can't tell anyone, got it? To his credit, Nautilus didn't throw even one suspicious or distrustful glance at Drifter. It seemed the boy had already accepted him as part of their little group. Drifter would do everything in his power to honor that trust. I understand. Then. Shall we test it? Drifter. Readily accepting the party invite she sent him, Drifter smiled at his friends. I suppose they are as good as a target as we can get without going into the labyrinth. Nautilus pointed a finger at the pack of dire wolves waiting in ambush a few dozen meters away. Drifter took a look and nodded. Nautilus and Yuna were both too low level to go into the labyrinth for now. Yuna had used most of her time to get her musical instruments up, and Nautilus never left her side, so he didn't get much of a chance to level. They only reached Tulbana because they were with a bigger group of players at the time. And, while Drifter was confident in taking care of them if things went wrong with the dire wolves, the same couldn't be said for the much stronger ruined kobolds inside the dungeon. This should do. Let's kill all of them but one first. Remember, safety above all else. We can always find more mobs later. Got it. Let's do it. Without much surprise, Drifter had become the leader of their small party. He was older, higher leveled, and his years in the workforce added a certain amount of maturity to his words which, according to Yuna, reminded his two younger companions of their teachers. Drifter wasn't sure how he felt about that comparison. Anyway, now wasn't the time to think about that. He followed closely as Nautilus took point against the four wolves, shield on his left arm, and a one-handed curved blade on the other. Drifter was right behind him, planning on using his longer reach to keep any mobs from flanking the other player. Finally, Yuna stood a little farther away, holding her flute. She was originally a dagger user, and the weapon was still hanging on her waist in case anything unexpected happened. Grr. Rarg. Nautilus blocked as the first dire wolf lunged at him, and pushed the mob away with his shield. Even as he took a step back due to the impact, his sword struck down with surprising speed, leaving a red gash across the animal's flank. Drifter followed with a blow of his own, impaling the mob through the eye, and killing it immediately. He didn't stop there, though. 2 days of fighting alone against this kind of mob had allowed him to understand their attack patterns. He swiped his spear to the right, catching a dire wolf which was aiming for Nautilus' unguarded side. The blade user had his hands full at the moment, dealing with the third wolf. That left the fourth and last mob free to do whatever it wanted. Following whatever code it was that decided its aggro, the monster rushed at Drifter, who had just dispatched his second target. Very calmly, the spearman spun, and hit the mob in the snout with the blunt end of his weapon. While it dealt a lot less damage, which suited their purposes, the blow stunned the dire wolf for a few seconds. Normally, that would be the time to finish it off, but instead Drifter turned to look at Nautilus, who had just slain his enemy, his health bar also untouched. Step back, Nautilus. Yuna, if you would. As they had discussed beforehand, now that only one mob was left, Nautilus left the battlefield for Drifter, who had the highest HP out of the three. Meanwhile, Yuna brought her flute to her lips, and started playing Rest. Drifter noticed that a blue cross appeared next to his name in the HUD as soon as he heard the first note of the song. When he allowed the dire wolf to hit him once, taking away about 7% of his health, it started regenerating. It's working. Yuna's eyes sparkled with joy, but she didn't interrupt the music. Nautilus grinned, and joined the fight, and the two made quick work of the poor mob. Great. How's the rate? Drifter didn't answer immediately. He was staring intently at his health bar until it was back to full. Only then did he focus on his two nervous companions, Yuna more so than Nautilus. About 1% every 3 seconds. Yuna's eyes visibly dimmed, the joy fading away and replaced by disappointment. That's not a lot. It was understandable that the songstress was feeling down. She wasn't a bad fighter, but she loved music, and, if she could incorporate it into her play style, she was sure she would be much more useful to Nautilus and Drifter. Drifter could see that his new friend was overthinking things. He patted her head, which prompted Yuna to look up, and smiled. It's not as bad as you think, Yuna. To start with, that's a party-wide health regen, and for free on top of that. Not only that, but you just acquired this skill, it is still 0 out of 1,000 proficiency, or 1 out of 1,000 now, I suppose. Point is, it will get stronger over time, and so will you. Like magic, Yuna's face brightened up, and she hugged Drifter. Stunned, he was trying to figure out if he should return the gesture or not when the songstress dragged Nautilus into it, and Drifter almost stabbed him with the spear he was still holding. The two men looked at each other, then burst out laughing. When they finally stopped giggling, and Yuna released them, the three felt they had become a lot closer. The trio then spent the rest of the afternoon getting used to fighting together. Nautilus and Drifter's teamwork slowly became more and more seamless. They still had a long way to go, but it was a start. When the sun started to set, marking the end of their third day in SAO, they returned to Talbana. Nautilus and Yuna went to the inn, while Drifter decided to wander around the city some more. The players who went to the labyrinth should start to come back soon, and he wanted first-hand intel before jumping into what was most certainly the most dangerous area of Aincrad up till now. I'm an idiot. Suddenly, Drifter stopped and slapped his forehead. If he wanted information, there was one person he had to ask. Pulling up his menu, he saw that Argo had accepted his friend request. That would make talking to her a lot easier. Drifter, hey Argo, you there? Not even 10 seconds later, his HUD pinged. Argo, what up Kibu? Miss me already? Rolling his eyes, he decided to entertain her. Drifter, yeah. How is my favorite little rat doing? Scammed. I mean, scored many pieces of information today. Argo, you know you can't stutter on a written message, don'tcha? Drifter, if YA can write in slangs, I can stutter. Argo, I regret befrienden ya. Drifter chuckled, causing a few players to throw him odd looks. Drifter, no you don't. But enough horsing around. I want to ask about the labyrinth. This time Argo's answer took a while to come. If it was yesterday, he might just think she was busy with other things. After witnessing her fragile side this morning, however, he could picture the info broker twisting her whiskers in deep thought. And, just as expected, her message was short. Argo, so you are going in there, huh? Promise you will be careful. Drifter smiled. It was nice to have a little sister who worried for you. It was particularly awesome when said little sister also happened to be a skilled informant. Drifter, I don't plan on biting the dust so early. After receiving her confirmation, Drifter waited. And then he waited some more. Only after 5 minutes had passed, and he was starting to question what was taking Argo so long, he remembered who he was talking to. Smiling wryly, he typed another message. Argo, that's my boy. I ain't got much for now, so 1500 COR will do, smiley face. Of course there was a smiley face at the end of her sentence. Why wouldn't there be? Sighing, Drifter watched as most of his money drained away. At least Argo's intel was worth it. From mobs attacks to a small and incomplete map of what parts of the labyrinth had been explored until now, it had pretty much everything Drifter could want. Just before closing his message tab, he saw one last notification from Argo. Grinning, Drifter switched his eyes back to the city. As he expected, night had brought a different kind of hustle. He saw lots of tired faces, and not just a few shaken ones. There was even a man sitting on the ground, hugging his knees and crying. Others were trying to comfort him, but it didn't seem to make an effect. Drifter dreaded to think what brought out such display. It wasn't his place to interfere, so he tore his gaze away. Most players who were entering Talbana now seemed exhausted, their armor and equipment in shambles. Just another reminder of how much harder the labyrinth was compared to the maps outside. But any player who could survive the labyrinth was either very good, or very lucky. Drifter was willing to bet the former was the majority. And having so many elite players in one place created opportunities. All around, he saw people trading, forming parties, bartering, buying, and selling. Once again, he was impressed by how strong-willed they were. Hey, it's you again. Drifter had noticed the merchant from earlier, agile, from the moment he entered the plaza. It was hard not to, considering how tall he was. His small shop seemed to be doing well, if the number of players looking for replacements for their broken equipment was anything to measure by. Drifter's eyes were instantly attracted to one of his wares. A rusty old spear, seemingly made entirely of iron. He could tell that, ugly as it looked, it was much better than the old soldier spear he currently used. Did this catch your fancy? Take a look at it. Agile also noticed his interest, and threw the weapon to him. He wasn't worried about Drifter stealing it, since it belonged to him, and he could store it back in his inventory anytime he wished. Drifter caught the spear, and felt it was much heavier than his own. He swiped a finger over it to look at its status, and whistled. It was simply called Cobalt Spear, but it was stronger than his current weapon by a mile. Unfortunately, that was reflected in the cost. Sighing in dejection, he handed the weapon back to Agile. The merchant wasn't too fussed, and threw him an understanding gaze. In a show of kindness, he told Drifter where he could get a Cobalt Spear for free. Those drop from dungeon mobs. But you better not go into the labyrinth willy-nilly. A new weapon won't do you any good if you are dead. The black man subtly gestured towards the crying man from earlier with his head, a grave expression on his face. They met two ruined kobold patrols at the same time. Only he and one more managed to make it back. I see. Fuck this game. Ha. Couldn't agree more, buddy. Anyway, be careful out there. I will. Expect me to become one of your patrons when I get a bit more COR, Agile. See you around. I will be waiting. See ya. Chapter 8, First Floor Labyrinth, November 9, 2022, Aincrad, First Floor, Talbana. It was the middle of the morning, and Drifter, Yuna, and Nautilus were standing just outside of Talbana. Drifter was, at this moment, trying, and failing, to appease a very pissed-off Yuna. He hadn't thought she would have that great of a reaction when he told them that he would be going to the labyrinth today. Alone. I just don't understand. Why can't we stay together? Why do you want to go there? Drifter glanced at Nautilus pleading for aid, but the boy refused to look at him. He seemed intent on ignoring Drifter. He sighed. Honestly, I'm a bit overleveled for the mobs outside, Yuna. And you and Nautilus proved more than capable of taking care of yourselves. Then we will go with you. No. Why not? Humph. You said yourself we are very capable. It's different. I talked with a lot of people and bought Argo's intel. The mobs inside the tower are much more dangerous. Another reason for you not to go. Yuna crossed her arms and glared at Drifter. He could do little but scratch the bridge of his nose in exasperation. Listen, Yuna. If I want to get stronger, that's where I have to be. Why are you so fixated on getting stronger? So we can get out of this hell escape. Aincrad definitely didn't look like a hell escape. Just the first floor was already a beautiful place, full of plains, grassy hills, forests, and clean rivers. But to Drifter, to any player, this was their personal hell. And Yuna knew that. Can't you just wait a few more days? Not, and I will work hard. We will get to level 8 before you know it. It was a tempting proposition. Having someone to watch your back while you fought was at the very least reassuring. But Drifter shook his head. Yuna stomped the ground, unhappy, but knew it was impossible to change his mind. All right. But only for 2 days, you hear me? 2 days. Then we will be joining you whether you like it or not. Drifter raised his hands in surrender. Yuna was still very angry, because she grabbed Nautilus's arm and dragged him away. The player, who seemed to find a kindred spirit in Drifter after the scolding session, raised a fist in goodbye before quickly lowering it when Yuna poked him in the ribs. Despite knowing that would just upset her more, Drifter couldn't help but chuckle. After the two had left, he walked towards the entrance to the first floor labyrinth, killing a few mobs along the way. Not much later, he arrived at the base of the giant tower that connected 2 floors of Aincrad. In front of him was a gate which wouldn't look out of place in a palace. Without hesitation, Drifter entered. The labyrinth was composed of countless passages, bridges, and paths. The cardinal directions seemed to stop working as soon as he set foot inside. Luckily his map would automatically update as he walked, or he would be really worried about never finding his way out. Argo's guide was also undeniably helpful in this situation. Drifter made slow progress in the labyrinth. Sliding his spear off of his back, he took careful, measured steps. Maybe he was being overly cautious, but everything he had learned about this place pointed to just one thing: make a single wrong move, and you are done. His caution paid off, and he heard the mobs before he saw them. Tightening his grip on his spear, he peeked around the corner, and saw 3 bipedal monsters. They looked like a mix between humans and dogs, with red skin and cruel little beady eyes. Unlike the mobs outside, those ruined kobolds used weapons, and one of them even had a piece of armor. 2 of them were holding short one-handed axes, and the third had the same spear Agile was selling. Maybe, if Drifter was lucky, it would drop. But he had to kill them first for that to happen. Taking a deep breath, Drifter turned the corner, instantly catching the aggro of the mobs. They snarled, and rushed at him. Drifter stabbed the one in front of the pack, but the ruined kobold sidestepped, and his spearhead only nicked its skin, barely taking off a few % of its health. Drifter wasn't expecting the monsters to be so agile, and panicked slightly when the kobold closed in on him, axe raised. It was one thing to read about it in Argo's guidebook, and another entirely to face the real thing. Stumbling back, Drifter raised his spear and hurriedly blocked the blow. A small part of his mind saw how a good fourth of the weapon's durability vanished. The bigger part of it was focused on staying alive. Both staggered back when they clashed, but Drifter recovered faster than the ruined kobold. Instead of going for a counterattack, the player took the chance to put some distance between them, at the same time dodging the other 2 mobs. After steadying himself, Drifter scanned his opponents. Their AI didn't allow them to think too deeply, so instead of encircling him, all 3 were attacking head-on. A perfect opportunity to test out his newest skill. Drifter's spear glowed green, and he swung out 2 times, from the left to the right, and then back to the left. All 3 mobs were caught by the swipes, the one in the middle particularly so, its health bar dropping to yellow. Horizontal arc had been unlocked yesterday, after Drifter's one-handed lance mastery reached 90 points. It was a simple skill, basically adding 1 more attack to horizontal. It was also damn useful. During the second long cooldown, Drifter didn't stay idle. He had learned the hard way that staying still while waiting for your skill to recharge was both a waste of time and a vulnerability. So, he filled that gap with 2 normal strikes, all aimed at the ruined kobold with the lowest health. Something every player, every fighter knew was that when you were outnumbered, you should focus on dwindling the enemy's numbers. It was better to fully kill 1 mob than to heavily damage all. As the ruined kobold's health reached red, the patrol also recovered from the staggering effect of horizontal arc. One of them came up of his right, the one-handed axe aimed at Drifter's midsection. Another was trying to chop off his head. Right then, Drifter made a quick, and probably bad, choice. Instead of retreating or defending, he pressed on. Activating Rage Spike, he leaped forward, dodging the kobold trying to decapitate him. That would almost certainly be a critical strike, and he didn't want to see how much that would take off of his health. Unfortunately, that also meant he couldn't completely avoid the mob on his right. His spear impaled the center ruined kobold and shattered it into pixels at the same moment the axe dug into his flank. If this was real life, Drifter's guts would most certainly be spilling on the ground and he would be passed out due to the pain. But this was SAO, so he just grunted when the impact forced him back, and watched his HP drop by a good 30%. It was worth it. With just 2 enemies to deal with, Drifter became much more at ease. While chugging a health potion, gods, those tasted awful, he dodged 2 strikes from the ruined kobolds. With a horizontal, he dispatched the second mob. Unconsciously, Drifter relaxed. After all, he just had 1 more kobold, already in yellow, to slay. And as it always goes, it was right then that things went wrong. The axe in the ruined kobold's hand suddenly glowed red, and accelerated. A small part of Drifter's brain recognized that as the one-handed axe skill double cleave. He had read about it in Argo's guidebook, but in the heat of the moment, he forgot that ruined kobolds were demi-human mobs, and, as such, could also use sword skills. That memory lapse almost cost him his life. Unable to dodge in time, Drifter was hit head-on by the skill, 2 savage strikes leaving deep cuts in his chest. His health, which had recovered to full after the potion, instantly fell to the lower end of yellow, almost red. If it wasn't for the chest armor he was wearing, Drifter would be in fatal danger. As it was, he was still very much terrified. Arg. In a desperate bid to survive, he kicked the kobold. It did next to no damage, but it forced the mob far enough back that he could rear back his spear, and thrust it through the mob's neck. He did it once, twice, thrice, until he wiped out the ruined kobold's health. Panting heavily, Drifter crumbled to the ground. Hugging his spear like some sort of comfort pillow, he glanced at the health bar in the top left corner of his vision. That was close. Too close. He had gotten overconfident. Complacent. Ha. Ha ha ha. Yuna can't ever know about this. I would never hear the end of it. While waiting for his HP to slowly recover through the passive regeneration when out of combat, and aided by a health potion, Drifter skimmed through the notifications he received. Whoa. It was no surprise the players in Talbana were so much stronger than others. Just eliminating a single kobold patrol had filled almost half of his experience bar. Granted, he was alone so he didn't have to split the experience with anyone, and he had almost died, but still. The only unfortunate thing was that the kobold spear he wanted hadn't dropped. What it had dropped was a lot of materials, however. Those would sell for quite a bit. Or maybe he should keep them, and use it to enhance his and his party's equipment. And also. Drifter clicked on a certain item, and watched a chunk of raw meat materialize in his hands. He had to fight the urge to throw it away. That would be one ingredient he would not be using. Ever. Storing it away, Drifter got up. When he looked at the depths of the tower, his gaze was filled with determination like never before. He had survived his first fight in here. The labyrinth hadn't conquered him, never mind how close it had come. SAO hadn't conquered him. He would conquer it. He continued, this time even more carefully. Drifter encountered and destroyed another 2 patrols of ruined kobolds before he heard the sounds of fighting. After hesitating for a few seconds, he clenched his teeth and rushed towards the noise. It might be a bad decision, but he would hate himself if he later discovered another party had been annihilated, and that it might have been because of his inaction. When he rounded the corner, Drifter saw a party of 4 fighting 3 of the mobs. 2 of the players, who used shields, were holding back an enemy each, focusing on defending rather than attacking. The remaining players, 2 sword users, were teaming up to face the last ruined kobold. All of their health bars were in the green. Drifter stopped a distance away from them, and sighed in relief. The party had good coordination, and seemed to be able to handle the kobold patrol with ease. They were still wary of their surroundings, and had noticed Drifter as soon as he arrived. He raised a hand in greeting. Do you need any help? No. Ugh. But thanks. Drifter nodded, and took a few steps back to avoid entering the aggro range of the mobs by mistake or distracting the fighters. Despite the party leader's rejection, he decided to stay nearby until their scuffle ended, just in case anything went wrong. Luckily, it didn't. After the 2 who were ganging up on the ruined kobold finished it off, they joined hands with the 3rd player, and then the 4th, making quick work of the remaining mobs. Drifter thought to himself that Yuna and Nautilus really did need to level up quickly. It would be much easier, not to mention safer, if he had his friends with him. Walking up to them, Drifter greeted the players. He seemed to have left a good impression because they were very friendly. The party leader, a light blue-haired, player Ho went by Diavel, shook his hand. Thanks for the offer to help, and for sticking around. It's good to know there's someone out there willing to offer a hand to those in need. Anyone would have done the same. Drifter gave a polite reply, which both Diavel and his companions seemed to find funny, judging by the chuckles. I played enough MMOs to know that's not true. But let's hope you are right. I will see you around, man. Thanks again. Drifter nodded, and the party walked off. They didn't question why he was alone, nor they offered for him to join them, and he was more than okay with that. He would have rejected anyways. It was one thing before, but now that they knew SAO was a death game, everyone had become much warier of strangers. Shaking his head, Drifter chose a path different than the one Diavel and the others had gone. There were a few hours still until he had to return to Talbana. Chapter 9, The Blacksmith Gore. Arg. Humph. Bringing his spear in a downright swing, Drifter split open the head of a ruined kobold. In the same movement, he crouched and amputated the leg of another. The mob fell, snarling, and still trying to bite him, but Drifter was unaffected. He twirled his spear in a display he would never have thought possible 4 days ago, and stabbed the mob in the chest. It dissipated in polygons, and Drifter examined his rewards. This was the 13th kobold patrol he had eliminated today, and that had already earned him 2 entire levels. He had also made a fair bit of money. Not enough to offset what he paid Argo, but that intel had already paid itself many times over. Suddenly, Drifter stopped his aimless skimming of the notifications. After giving it a good read to confirm he wasn't seeing things, a big smile parted his face. 2 clicks later, Drifter was holding a kobold spear in his hands. The weapon wasn't pretty. Quite ugly, in fact. It was rusty all over, and there seemed to be stains of dry blood covering it. But it was much stronger than his old soldier spear. Heavier too. Drifter actually liked that. His stats distribution was an even split between strength and dexterity. He would be able to employ them but better with a heavier weapon. He gave the kobold spear a few test swings, and grinned. He was almost sure this was a weapon that could last him a few floors, as long as he got the proper enhancements for it. Now that he had his new weapon, getting better armor was next on the list. Not for himself, but for Yuna. This was something both he and Nautilus agreed on, and refused to budge, much to the songstress's annoyance. If Yuna was going to play a supporting role, they would at least make sure she was properly equipped to survive. Rummaging through his inventory, Drifter frowned. Armor was a problem. The ruined kobolds didn't drop any, presumably because they didn't wear any, and his party was already equipped with the best you could buy from the NPCs outside. There might be some quests like the ones which rewarded the old soldier spear and the anneal blade, but those would take time to complete, and even then, would give only one piece of armor, which wasn't nearly enough for 3 people. Looking at all the crafting materials in his bag, boar hides and tusks, wolf pelts, kobold bones, and more, Drifter thought that it might be time to search for a player craftsman. He looked at the time. It was already 5:30 p.m. Outside, the sun would have already started to set over Aincrad. Time to go back. Drifter, where are you guys? Drifter, I'll be waiting in the plaza. Meet me there. After receiving a positive reply, Drifter looked over the shoulder of the player in front of him. More than 20 people to go still. As Drifter unfortunately discovered, there were only a couple of NPC blacksmiths in Talbana. That meant every single player in the city, and that amounted to a few hundred, needed to wait in line to repair their equipment. Quick as it was, Drifter was getting tired. He had spent the entire day fighting, and this was the last thing he needed. To distract himself from his boredom, Drifter let his eyes wander. Talbana was more crowded than yesterday. That made sense. Sooner or later, the 10,000 players, or 9,400 now, he grimly thought, would need to leave the town of beginnings and explore, unless they wanted to hide there forever, barely scrapping by every day by doing fetch quests. He supposed some would choose to do that, but not many. You could only take so much before going crazy. Suddenly, his random gazing stopped as he found something interesting. Sitting cross-legged under a tree was a player. A girl, which was the minority in SAO. But what caught his attention wasn't her gender, but rather the anvil and tools in front of her. Squeezing his memory, Drifter remembered seeing her in the same spot yesterday. Her impromptu stall was devoid of people. Without thinking too much, Drifter left the line and walked over. The brown-haired girl with a bob cut probably hadn't had a client in a while, because it took her a few seconds to notice him. She even looked around, as if to make sure he wasn't lost. "Can I help you?" "I was hoping you could." "You are a blacksmith, are you not?" The girl's eyes shot wide open, only now realizing Drifter had come to her because of what was very clearly her profession, and not because he wanted to flirt or berate her. "Why yes. I am. What do you need?" She scrambled to get up, and, despite already starting to regret his choice, Drifter couldn't help but chuckle. She reminded him of himself in his first job interview. "Relax. I need to repair some equipment." Drifter handed the girl his old soldier spear. He didn't quite understand how blacksmithing worked in the game, so he didn't want to risk what was now his main weapon. However, he figured it would do no harm to let the blacksmith try and repair his first spear. Worst-case scenario, he would lose it, but it would have no impact on his fighting capabilities. If, on the other hand, she succeeded, then he could keep it as a backup weapon in case he found himself in a difficult situation. Turns out, as he would discover later, he had nothing to worry about. Durability restoring could fail in the hands of a player blacksmith, but it wouldn't destroy or damage the equipment that was being repaired. The difference between NPCs and players was that an NPC blacksmith would restore the weapon's durability to full 100% of the time. A player, on the other hand, could not only fail or succeed, but also anywhere in between. The scene in front of him was the perfect example. The girl handed the old soldier spear back to Drifter with a sheepish and slightly embarrassed smile. "There you go. Sorry I couldn't get it back to tip-top condition. My weapon repairing skill is still very low. Hadn't had many chances to use it." From the way the blacksmith was looking down while talking, Drifter got the distinct feeling that, while he might be her first customer in a while, there had been others before, and they hadn't been happy with only getting half of their weapon's durability back. To be honest, Drifter also wasn't all that pleased. But he was unable to bring himself to berate the girl, when it was very clear that she had tried her best. After all, the success rate was out of her control. "There you go." "Heh." He transferred half of what he would have paid at the NPC repairman to a very stunned blacksmith. When she looked at him with a question in her eyes, any resentment he had left vanished, and he chuckled. This is my backup weapon, so I don't mind if its durability is a little low. I might never use it after all. But I hope you don't mind that I get my armor repaired with the NPC. The kobolds hit pretty damn hard, and I need it to be as sturdy as it can get. Ah, not at all. Thanks for trusting me with your weapon. No problems. That's how the job market works, ain't it? You need experience, but nobody is willing to hire someone without experience. Your skill's the same. You need to repair more weapons for it to go up, but no one trusts you because it ain't high enough. Well, let me be the person that is willing to hire a green hand. Or, in your case, a low-level blacksmith. Oh. Thank you. Drifter grinned. He could have let it at that, but they said honesty was the best policy, no. And making more friends couldn't be bad. Don't. I will be blunt with you, I have a motive other than goodwill. A not-so-pure one. The girl frowned and took a step back, hand reaching for the warhammer in her waist, even if the city was a safe zone. Drifter quickly raised his hands to appease her. Wait, don't get me wrong. I just want to establish connections. See, I noticed that we can't get anything better than this from the NPCs and mobs. Drifter knocked on his breastplate with a closed fist to emphasize his point. The blacksmith followed his gesture, and nodded in silent agreement. She still hadn't let her guard down. Well, I deduced that the only way to get better equipment is to have a player make it for you. And you are the first blacksmith that I met, so. Only then did the girl relax completely. She retraced the step she had taken back, and her eyes sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who was talking about what they loved. You are right. I discovered that too. The equipment the townsfolk sell is too low quality. Though. I say that, but I haven't managed to create anything better yet. Her voice, full of vigor at the beginning, dropped towards the end. But Drifter shook his head. I imagined so, otherwise there would be players swarming you to buy your stuff. Which is why I said I want to build connections. Even if you can't make anything good now, it doesn't mean it will be the same later, right? Look, I have some materials I got today. Even some more from a quest I did. I will give them to you, and you try and forge armor. Even if you don't make anything worthwhile at the start, you can hand them to me, and I can sell them to the NPCs to make back some cash. Consider it payment for the mats. It's a win-win. You raise the mastery of your skills, and I get first pick when you end up forging armor that's better than that crap they sell around here. Honestly, Drifter thought he was making a pretty sweet offer. After all, he wasn't asking the girl to make him equipment for free just because he once gave her some materials. He just wanted to get to choose first before she showed whatever she made to other players. But even he wasn't expecting her to jump on his proposition without so much as a second thought. But that was exactly what happened. I accept. I accept. Thank you so much. You have no idea how desperate I was getting. The two of them spent the next minutes talking things through. Drifter discovered that her name was Lisbeth, or Liz for short, and sent her a friend invite which she readily accepted. Apparently, apart from weapon repairing, Liz only had two other support skills in her repertoire, light metal armor forging and metal armor repairing, both of which suited Drifter and his party perfectly. Be it him, Nautilus, or Yuna, none had enough stat points in vitality to use heavy armor. Yuna, in fact, was leaning more towards the soft and flexible leather armor. Speaking of his friends, Drifter saw them arriving at the plaza, and waved. They spotted Liz, and exchanged glances between themselves before walking over. Yuna had a teasing smile on her lips. Say, Drifter, do you just talk to every pretty girl you see? 'Cause you are 2 for 2. The songstress was obviously referring to herself. Meanwhile, Liz blushed bright red at being called pretty. Drifter sighed, and flicked Yuna on the forehead, which had Nautilus holding back a snicker. If I remember correctly, it was you who approached me first, miss. Anyway, Liz, those are Yuna and Nautilus, my party members. Yuna, Nautilus, meet Liz, Aincrad's most skilled blacksmith. At least that's the hope. That got both of his friends' interest. While Liz was trying to explain that she wasn't that good and Drifter was exaggerating, Yuna completely overrode her argument, and pulled the girl into a conversation, leaving the two boys standing confused. The two players exchanged glances, and Drifter promptly started to giggle. Nautilus seemed to have gone back into his shell due to having to talk to someone other than Yuna and Drifter, but he was sure the boy would open up with time. Taking the bread that Nautilus offered him, Drifter sat down and started composing a message to Argo. Drifter, met a blacksmith today. Lisbeth. Thought you might be interested. She is not that great, but from what I've seen it is because no one was willing to let her try. I struck a deal with her, I supply the mats, and get first pick. Argo, oh. For someone who wasn't wantin' to leave the starting town, you sure made a lot of friends hella quick, dri boo. Even formed a party, I. Drifter, how did you even know that? Argo, it's my job, ain't it? I hear things. But, 'bout that blacksmith you was tellin' me. What do you want for that? Drifter chuckled. Friends they may be, the info broker wasn't about to take his intel for free. Business was business. Drifter, do you know anything about better ores or mats than what's readily available? Argo, hold one. I will get back to ya. Using the small intermission, Drifter raised his head and saw Liz enthusiastically explaining about each of her tools to a curious Yuna, while Nautilus watched from a distance with a smile. He saw some players hesitantly approaching, probably attracted by the fact that 3 people had been crowding around Liz's blacksmithing station for a while. The short-haired girl would probably squeal in excitement when she noticed. His HUD pinged with a new message from Argo, bringing his attention back to the matter at hand. Drifter had figured that just what he told her about Liz wouldn't be enough for the info broker, and he was right. He quickly sent her the fee. Argo, in the beta there was a spot at the northwest of the first floor, by the riverside. There are some fish monsters that used to drop mats that could be used for Jin. A player confirmed the mobs still exist, but he was too low level to kill one, so I don't know if drops are still the same. Drifter, got it. Can I exchange some information about the mobs for intel about whatever it is that they drop? Argo, deal. But remember this is old info. Kayaba might have changed things from the beta. Drifter, I will be careful. Thanks little rat. Argo, you gonna pay for the teasing someday, dri boo. Smell ya. Drifter chuckled as he closed the message tab, and clapped his hands to get Yuna's and Nautilus's attention. What do you think about a field trip? Chapter 10, Field Trip. The 5th day of imprisonment of the SAO players dawned just as beautiful as the 4 others before. Drifter was starting to really hate this always perfect weather. But he made an effort to look like he was enjoying it, because Yuna looked happy. He really admired her simplicity. Not that Yuna was dumb or slow in any way, of course. Quite the opposite. She was scary smart, he had already discovered. But she was also really good at enjoying the moment. In her own words, since we are already stuck here, might as well make the most of it. And, Drifter had to be honest, when she started playing music, the day got a lot more bearable. Not for the first time, Drifter thought that Yuna wasn't just good, she was a genius. Drifter hung back as Nautilus fought 2 frenzy boars. He wanted to help originally, but it turned out that his level was high enough that he could one-shot the mobs. Since one of their objectives today was to gain some fighting experience, Drifter would only interfere if his friends were in trouble. Luckily, it didn't seem necessary. Nautilus was a natural with his curved blade, and had been making huge progress in his techniques since yesterday. And while Yuna was more of a support class player, she also could hold her own with her dagger. So, the trio made good time to the river Argo had told Drifter about. He also couldn't help but notice that mobs grew tougher the farthest they were from the starting area, the town of beginnings. Here, on the exact opposite end of the first floor, a pack of dire wolves could probably give a singular ruined kobold a run for their money. The party still took care of them with ease, however. After his near-death experience yesterday, which he hadn't told his friends about yet, neither planned on doing anytime soon, Drifter felt stronger than before. It wasn't like his stats had grown or he learned new skills, but more like understood things better. Didn't people say that when you almost died, time seemed to slow down and your life flashed before your eyes? Well, Drifter felt like that, only all the time. And, from what he had gathered, he wasn't the only one. Drifter was reminded of the player he had seen when he was leaving the labyrinth yesterday. At first he looked just like any other teenager, with a sword, but this was SAO after all, but then Drifter caught a glimpse of him fighting. The way the boy positioned himself and fought was very reminiscent of what Drifter himself learned to do. He knew just from that the player had faced a life-threatening situation too. Hey, I hear running water. Nautilus pointed towards a small cluster of trees to their left. When Drifter strained his ears, he also heard the river. Activating, searching, he saw blue streaks flowing past the tree line. Yup, it's over there all right. Be careful now, Argo mentioned that cyan rock fish are stronger than normal mobs. Yuna, stay at the back, and be ready to play rest. The songstress nodded, and Drifter walked a few steps forward to stand in line with Nautilus. According to the guidebook, the cyan rock fish's primary attack method was to shoot out of the water and smash into unsuspecting players. They were appropriately named after their rock-hard bright cyan scales, so it was a no-brainer that they hit hard. At the same time, however, if he could withstand the first attack and trap them on land, the mobs would be pretty much defenseless. Since they had been forewarned, the party was keeping an eye out for the telltale signs of the cyan rockfish attacking, such as a shadow under the water. This was harder to spot than one would imagine, since the river was quite fast-flowing. Drifter only saw the mob half a second before it charged out of the water and towards his head. It was enough time to raise his spear, though. Unable to change directions in midair, the cyan rockfish crashed straight into Drifter's cobalt spear. Instead of being skewered, however, the mob slid across the spearhead, losing a third of its health, and barreling straight into a tree. The plant groaned and cracked, before breaking in half. Holy! The trio looked at the downed tree with wide-open eyes. It was no wonder Argo's informant hadn't managed to kill the mob. With such force, it was a surprise they hadn't been the ones to die instead. Air. You know how the plan was for me to use my shield to block. How about? No. Yup. Agreed. The trio stared at the fish flopping on the ground, slowly but surely making its way back to the river. Not that they would ever allow that. Taking advantage of the fact that it was quite literally defenseless, Drifter and Nautilus quickly stabbed it to death. Even Yuna got in on the action with her dagger. When the mob disappeared, she looked through the notifications and pulled out a shiny cyan scale. So, this is what we are looking for. Drifter tapped on the cyan rockfish scale, and whistled when he saw its durability. Yup, that's definitely it. Sending a screenshot of the item to his favorite info broker, Drifter turned to the river, and lifted his spear. Just gotta get 49 more of these. Eventually, they set into a nice rhythm. Drifter was responsible for aggroing the mobs and deflecting their first attack, then Nautilus would come in and finish them off. Meanwhile, Yuna was playing different songs in the background, not because she couldn't help them, but rather because they has figured that since rest could become a skill, so could other songs. Unfortunately, they still had no success as of now. The good news was that they had gotten 50 scales, which should be more than enough for Liz to raise her blacksmithing level, and then some. Let's call it a day. There's still a few hours of daytime left. Those things give good experience, but take too long to respawn. Let's move west a little and grind. Ugh. Drifter ignored Yuna's groans. He understood that fighting the same mob again and again was boring, but they couldn't waste time just because of that. Every day they spent doing nothing while inside SAO was a day they lost in the real world. Talk talk. Ogawa Kana looked up from where she had been sitting, holding her son's hand while he laid in the hospital bed. Her eyes were puffed up from crying, and she couldn't muster the energy to get up. Talk talk. When the person outside the hospital room insisted, she forced herself to let go of her son, and answer. The one outside couldn't be a doctor or nurse, since they wouldn't knock. Maybe it was one of Itsuki's friends. Walking slowly, like a woman much older than she actually was, Kana made her way to the door, and opened it. Standing outside was a somewhat young man in a suit, with thin glasses and an amicable smile on her face. Miss Ogawa. I'm Kikuka Seijiru, from the Ministry of Internal Affairs Telecommunications Bureau, Advanced Network Division, 2nd Office. Do you mind if I enter? I was hoping to talk with you. Kana didn't know what most of what the men said meant, but he seemed. Well, not exactly important, more like an office worker. But he was from the government, so she quickly invited him in, and offered him some tea, which he politely declined. I won't stay long, Miss Ogawa. You are the 6th relative of a SAO victim I am meeting today, and there are many more on the list. Is there some problem with my Itsuki, Mr. Seijiru? Please, just Kikuka will do, Miss Ogawa. And no, there's nothing wrong, apart from the obvious. This is more of a routine visit. I have been assigned as the lead investigator of the Sword Art Online Case Victims Rescue Force. Me and my team are working our hardest to free the SAO players with as little harm done to their health as possible. I wanted to introduce myself, as well as leave my contact information with you. Saying that, Kikuka handed Kana a card with his details, and smiled warmly. I might not be able to answer immediately always, but one of my subordinates will always be available to give you updates on Itsuki's condition. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Seiji. Kikuka. Kana made to bow but was stopped by Kikuka, who had an expression of embarrassment. After making some more small talk, he got up to leave. Kana led him to the door, and gripped his arm before he could cross it. Am I Itsuki? He will be okay, won't he? Patting the frail mother's hand, Kikuka nodded with certainty. He will, Miss Ogawa. He already survived past the worst first couple of days. He will be all right. Excusing himself, Kikuka gave the young man on the bed one last glance. He couldn't see his face under the nerve gear. Bowing to Kana, he closed the door softly behind him, his smile turning into a pensive expression. Kikuka hadn't been entirely honest with Kana. While they couldn't see what was happening inside SAO, his task force could still monitor the vitals of every player, and Itsuki was more active than most. And he wasn't the only one. All across Japan, several hundred players seemed to be much more active than the rest. This was a pattern that seemed to be followed by death in many cases. His team's best guess was that those players were the ones actively fighting to clear the game, and, as such, were the ones in most risk. He didn't tell Kana that. Better let the woman think her son was safe. Here, from the outside, all they could do was pray, anyway. And Kikuka did just that. He hoped, from the bottom of his heart, that Itsuki survived. Gods knew he didn't need to see another mother crying over her dead son. Inside SAO, Drifter had no idea of how he was being monitored, or how Kikuka had put him in a pay attention to list. Right now, his vitals were probably resulting in very ordinary readings, because he was feeling quite relaxed at the moment. It was incredible how quickly you could get used to being inside a death game. Fighting, more like decimating, wolves and boars had become the norm. Looking over his two younger friends, Drifter decided that he would take them to the labyrinth tomorrow. And, as much as he disliked the idea, he would tell them about his near-death experience. Any amount of scolding by Yuna was worth it if it kept them from underestimating the tower or overestimating themselves. As Drifter very nearly discovered, carelessness meant death. Hooray! Shouting came from the distance, and Drifter and Nautilus immediately positioned themselves so that Yuna was protected behind them. It seemed the yelling was of the joyful sort, and it wasn't directed at them, but you could never be too careful. Should we? Might as well. But don't let your guard down. When the trio walked towards the commotion, they saw a group of 6 or 7 young men, maybe around Drifter's age, or just a little older. They were crowding around a redhead with unruly hair and a short stubble, who seemed to be cosplaying as a samurai, if his katana and armor were any indication. Whatever it was that just happened, it must be really good, because the group was chattering endlessly. Or maybe they just were like that normally. Anyway, Drifter knew he would have a headache if the other party saw them, so he exchanged glances with Nautilus and Yuna, who seemed to think the same, and promptly turned around and left. About an hour later, they arrived in Talbana. Drifter greeted Agile, who gave him a nod from behind his stall, and walked to Liz. The blacksmith was busy repairing a party's equipment. It seemed that after their rather lengthy stay at her station yesterday, some people had become interested, and discovered the benefits of going to a player blacksmith, namely, the cheap price. Nautilus and Drifter joined the short queue, and Yuna went directly behind the anvil to chat with Liz. Then the songstress winked at her partners, and pulled out her flute. As the upbeat notes started to float out, more players turned their gaze in their direction. Nautilus raised an eyebrow. You know, if your plan was to have Liz become our personal blacksmith, I think Yuna just ruined that. Meh, what can you do? At least the song is good. That's one of her favorites. Haven't heard her play it since we got stuck here. Drifter looked at his friend, who had lapsed in sorrowful silence, and smacked his shoulder. Hey, bad as things are, at least she is happy right now, ain't she? Nautilus looked at Yuna, who smiled with her eyes, but never stopped playing. Slowly, a grin also appeared on his face. Yeah. Let's keep it that way.